Okay, so let me give the official welcome. Oh, hey, Krista, good to see you. Let me give the official welcome on behalf of Denver Data Storytellers. My name is Paul Collier. I am one of the co-organizers of Denver Data Storytellers, which is essentially a professional community based in Denver of folks that do data communications. And we're very open to all skill levels, from folks who are just dabbling into data communications, visualization, and storytelling, to folks who have made it their life's work, like Veronica. So super glad to have her here with us, sharing more about her experience and work with CPR. So we host some educational and some social events, generally aim for, one every month or so. And then some months there are two and some months there are none. So we actually had a happy hour last week. That was really fun, had about 12 people there. We've got this event today. And then we'll be taking a bit of a break over the early summer. We've got a book club coming up as well, though. So what else should you know about us? Totally sort of voluntary group. We've just established a meetup. We've got an email newsletter, which y'all should sign up for. We'll make sure to send that afterwards. And we have a Slack channel, which folks can get on and pose questions and meet other folks in the Denver data communications community. Katie and Krista, if you guys just wave, two of our other volunteer organizers. So they've helped us do different events. Krista has helpfully sent out our email newsletter. If there's anybody on this call who would be interested in joining our leadership team specifically to help us send our newsletter out, promoting our events and other community resources, we'd love to hear from you, because that's a really important role, and Chris has been holding down that ship for over a year now. So I think that's it about Denver Data Storytellers. Of course, happy to give any further context that folks want. But with that, I think we should turn it over more or less to Veronica. So Veronica and I met via email a few months ago. She's one of the newest data journalists in Colorado, works for Colorado Public Radio. And I would be surely doing her a disservice to try and speak her bio from memory. So with that, Veronica, let me turn it over to you. Would love to maybe you just give a little bit of background for everybody and then launch into what you were the story that we kind of had brainstormed together around digging into your work around wildfires in Colorado and just the process, that kind of got through that.
Sure. Hey, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Veronica Penney. I'm a data reporter at Colorado Public Radio News. I got into data reporting I actually went back to grad school at Columbia University in New York and got a degree in data journalism. And from there, I worked at Columbia for a while, worked at the New York Times for a year, and then came back to Colorado to do some work out here. So it's great to be here. I'm going to show you a little bit. Hopefully I can share my screen here. My Zoom just reinstalled, so we'll see if this works. Fingers crossed. There we are.
We can see it. Great.
Excellent. This guy here. All right. This is actually my final slide, of course. So one moment. All right. I'm going to tell you a little bit about an investigation I did last year with my colleague, Ben Marcus. And hopefully through that, I can teach you a little bit more about data journalism. Before I get started, data journalism is a term that gets tossed around a lot. So in case you haven't heard the term or it's new to you, it really means anything that combines data with journalism. So data journalism could include developers in a newsroom who work on news apps. If you think about the New York Times app or the Colorado Public Radio app, where people can actually look at a feed, that does count as data journalism. Sometimes bigger newsrooms, they'll have a desk of people who are kind of on call for reporters that do analysis or help with data requests. You can have graphics reporters who gather data and then try to kind of condense it down into a compelling visual to add to a story. That's data journalism. And then you can have essentially just reporters who do all the things that reporters normally do, which is go out and talk to people, write, publish stories, and they use data to guide their work. That's kind of more where I fall in. I do a fair bit of analysis. I also do graphics for the newsroom. But yeah, that's my role. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story I did last November. It was on investigating wildfire investigations. And as you have questions, please feel free to hop in. I'm going to rely on you, Paul and Katie, to help field those as I go through this. We published the story last November, my colleague and I, and the headline was "How Humans Start Most of Colorado's Wildfires and Get Away with It." So the premise of the story was most of the human-started wildfires in Colorado, those are the ones where investigators are like, we know it didn't start by lightning, like a human had to do this. How exactly it started, we don't know. So it could be, maybe a train on some tracks by Durango, a spark flew off and started a wildfire. It could be a catalytic converter. It could be a truck dragging chains. It could be someone who didn't extinguish a campfire properly. It could be any one of these things. And we just don't know. That's really where the story starts. Just a brief recap of the story in case you read it a while ago or haven't gotten to it yet. We basically found that Colorado was falling behind other states in the West, which is, the best thing to compare to other states who experience similar wildfires. And the reason that that's important is because if you find out how wildfires start, if you find that there's a pattern of people who aren't putting out their campfires properly, you can actually educate people about it and stop that. And I don't think any of us love living with smoky skies in the summer. The environmental damage is pretty bad. We didn't get into it in this story, but wildfires do put drinking water supplies for a lot of cities in Colorado at risk, as well as downstream. We're a headwater state. So they have a big impact and they're super costly, really dangerous. And this is just one small way that we can kind of start getting a handle on that. So we started the story off with this data. We go through people's stories and yeah, I'll get into the data a little bit here. In terms of where this story started, we actually didn't start looking into how Colorado investigates its wildfires. That wasn't even on our radar. We started by looking at the spree of arson arrests in California. We were like, wow, Cal Fire is really arresting a lot of arsonists. They're putting trackers on people's cars to see that people are moving from wildfire to wildfire. This is really interesting. I wonder if Colorado is doing anything like this. So we started looking at records. We pulled county court cases and state court cases to see if anyone had been charged with arson. There's actually a wildfire statute number that you can search by for federal court cases. So we started pulling that. We started also pulling copies of investigations for some of the largest wildfires in Colorado's history, just to see for those ones that didn't have, it was a truck dragging chains, it was a lightning strike, to see if maybe there was a chance that somebody had started that wildfire intentionally. And we also started looking through data. I was pretty fortunate in that I'd already done wildfire reporting for a while, so I knew two pretty good databases off the bat. The two best ones that I know of for this type of project are the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is in charge of the Forest Service. They have this database that's called the FPA-FOD. It's the Fire Program Analysis Fire Occurrence Database. And this is one that a lot of scientists and researchers use when they're looking at wildfire trends over time. So that was the main one that I used for this story. And then there's also the National Interagency Fire Center. They're in charge of really coordinating between local, state, and national fire departments. They hold records for wildfires from all these different agencies. So when there's a wildfire, the agency reports it and it's collected at the National Interagency Fire Center. The trouble with that data is you sometimes get duplicate wildfire records, and it can be kind of messy to clean because you might have someone at the state level entering a wildfire. You might have a couple of different local fire departments that were involved in the firefighting effort enter that fire. Then the U.S. Forest Service gets involved and they enter the fire, and all of the different fire size columns don't match. So anyway, we can get into that a little bit more later, but all that is to say, we started this story in a very different place. As I was, if you recall, looking at arson, I started trying to compare across states as best I could. So again, I knew from talking to experts about these databases that generally it would be good to exclude fires under 1,000 acres in size. That's because different states have different reporting requirements. Most states don't have reporting requirements at all, but 1,000 acres is a pretty big fire. So if there is a fire that size, there's a good chance it'll get captured in this data. And that just kind of adjusts for any kind of differences in how these fires are recorded across jurisdictions. I took out fires that had no known general cause, at least in my initial analysis. I wanted to get a sense of how many fires were started by people, how many fires were started by arsonists. And those fires, I'll describe the data a little bit so this makes more sense. You have general causes for fires, which is natural caused. That's pretty much always lightning. You have human caused, which could be any of those reasons I described earlier, trucks with chains, wildfires. And then you have fires with no known general cause. And that basically means that whoever entered this fire has no idea how it started. It could be that it's impossible to determine for some reason, but it could also be that they never looked into it. So I started by just kind of setting those fires off to the side to get a better sense of like the human impact on wildfires. And then I started doing all these different analysis, just kind of exploring the data. I looked at fires with unknown specific causes and what percentage of the total fires that was for human caused and natural caused. Surprisingly high for natural caused because those are mostly lightning, but again, data entry, you never know what's going on there. And just started exploring the data. Generally in data journalism, you kind of think of a database like a source, like somebody you're interviewing. So it helps to go in with a list of questions and just kind of ask those questions, and that can help guide your analysis. I looked at a state comparison. These are national databases, so you can really look at different states in the West to get a sense of how things stack up. I looked at different jurisdictions to see if any of these jurisdictions were just not entering wildfires or just weren't entering wildfire causes. I looked at, the Bureau of Land Management. Are they doing a better job than the Forest Service? Are there more records or more accurate records for those fires? And kind of started stacking together these different solve rates for different fires. And at this point, I had gone pretty far beyond arson because at the end of the day, like there just weren't a lot of arson records, and the records requests that we started getting back from these agencies, they didn't have enough information for us to be able to know that there was the same red SUV at 5 different fires. They were just pretty sparse. So this, of course, led to more questions. I started reaching out to different academics and experts to learn more about if all wildfires were being recorded. And that again came back to that 1,000-acre cutoff, how the data was being entered, which, mostly like these local jurisdictions, some US Forest Service, and then who was collecting the data and for what purpose. And that turned out to mostly be, at least with the National Interagency Fire Center, that was for reimbursements for disasters. So if a local fire department had a lot of man hours on a fire, they could actually get reimbursed for those firefighting efforts for disasters that hit wildfires that hit a certain disaster threshold. And that really helped explain some of the holes in the data, like why these causes weren't being added or updated. It's because it didn't matter. Like for the purpose of the National Interagency Fire Center, they only really care about the money that they're getting back to like these local agencies. They don't care as much about how the fire started. It really doesn't impact their day-to-day. So from there, asking all these questions of the data, putting all these pieces together, it really became clear that Colorado was an outlier. And through all this, I was keeping a data memo of just all the findings I had with different charts and different write-ups and quotes from experts that could help explain what was happening here. But before we really committed to doing this as a story, we had to make sure that there wasn't something really obvious that we were missing. So were we missing something in the data? Again, that goes back to some of those phone calls with wildfire scientists and academics. I also went ahead and called the people who maintain these databases to make sure, like over the years that they've been looking at this data, like, is there something about the way the Colorado system works where Colorado actually isn't falling short on finding how wildfires start? It's just something in how they're entering the data. They couldn't think of anything. And then we also wanted to know, does it matter how wildfires start? Like if nobody ever found out how these wildfires started, would that make any difference? So for that, we talked to national wildfire prevention experts. There's a lot of research and literature showing that if you can figure out how wildfires are starting and then communicate to people and start a campaign about it, you can help prevent those future wildfires, which could save homes and lives and, give some agencies perhaps a chance to get ahead on prescribed burning instead of waiting for these wildfire events that kind of get out of control. So there is some value there. We also talked to criminal investigators. We wanted to know if there were any statutes or requirements to investigate wildfires. If you suspect that an arsonist started a fire, is there any mandate that you have to investigate it? And by not investigating these fires, are any of these agencies breaking the law? From there, we also tried to learn more about how wildfire investigations unfold. So we talked to the fire investigators who are actually going step by step through this process. Wildfire investigations, turns out, are totally separate from other kinds of fire investigations. Wildfire investigators are often down literally on their hands and knees with magnifying glasses, looking for little pieces of shrapnel that can help show like how a fire started. And they'll go over maybe an acre of land like that, just combing it, trying to find clues to how all this started. So we talked to people who are both in state and out of state. We wanted to know if, we'd already seen that Colorado was solving fewer of these fires. Is there something about the system for investigating fires here that was different? We talked to people who worked for private investigation companies. Those are normally contracted out by insurance companies. Insurance companies want to know it's not like the beginning of Fight Club, like you didn't deliberately blow up your apartment to get a claim. So they'll hire private investigators for that, and they get pulled into wildfire claims. We talked to people at the county level about the resources they have, how many wildfire experts they have. And we talked to federal investigators to see how much time they have on an investigation, how many investigations they work, if there are enough investigators for the number of fires. We talked, my colleague Ben, I'll give him full credit here, he talked to every sheriff in the state. Sheriffs are in charge of wildfire investigations, sheriffs and fire chiefs, but in Colorado, it pretty much is all to the sheriff. Again, we talked to the US Forest Service. They have teams of regional investigators. So there are people in the Rocky Mountain region that will go between Colorado and these other regions investigating wildfires. And then we talked to state fire marshals in other states. Colorado doesn't have a state fire marshal, but state fire marshals are generally in charge of building codes and building fire investigations and wildfire investigations. So this is basically like 3 to 4 months of work in a very short time period here that I've condensed. So if you have any questions, definitely feel free to ask. But from there, after all this reporting, we started, at some point, you just have to start writing a story. You can report forever, but at some point it's probably good to like start sharing that with other people with what you found. So for any story, top of mind is always that you're basically asking somebody to spend 20 minutes to an hour of their day listening to or reading something that you've created. So you better make it worth their while. And up top, you want to really solidify, why does this matter? Why does it matter to you, reader, that we don't know how these wildfires are starting? So the big thing there is to figure out who's impacted by wildfires. You have the concrete ones. You have people who die in wildfires like Lyle and Marilyn Hillman. They both were killed in the East Troublesome fire. You have people who lose homes, who lose everything that they own, who are displaced. And then you have like this broader public in the Western US who's really impacted by this air quality for months at a time. We looked into insurance as well, but it didn't seem like insurance rates were affected too much. So for people who aren't directly losing a home, there isn't too much of a monetary loss. And then for crafting the story, it's pretty complicated. We have a lot of state agencies involved. So for the digital structure, we started off with that big data finding, Colorado's falling behind these other states. Why? And we could kind of just dive into it from there. We decided to open the story with scrolly telling because it is kind of nebulous, like this big policy story. So we start with these 2 little scrolling snippets of these 2 witnesses to 2 of the biggest wildfires in Colorado history. We have Colton McDonald, who saw he says he heard the start of the Cameron Peak wildfire. And then I believe his name was Joe. He saw the very early stages of East Troublesome. And that scrolling, it shows like a little snippet of what they saw. And then we say that they weren't contacted by investigators. And then from there, we dive into the data in the story. So we talk about how there are a lot of factors that contribute to Colorado maybe having a lower solve rate than other states. It's less of a priority. We circle back to Joe and Colton a little bit later in the story, and incorporating them in the story was actually pretty tricky. And it was because these fires actually haven't been solved yet. Like, they are suspected to be human caused, but from a framing perspective, it's really challenging to add these 2 people who had these compelling stories, Colton specifically, because he said he heard the start of it, and we didn't have any documentation that we could say like for sure he heard the start of this fire. So we also don't have any reason to believe that he didn't hear the start of the fire. We ran background checks. We cross-referenced his story with as many news articles as we could find, interviewed him multiple times, talked to like family and friends. So no reason to doubt that Colton didn't hear the start of the wildfire, but we also just didn't have a document from the US Forest Service saying that, this was started by this gunshot that this person claimed to hear. So when we put their narratives in the story, we really framed it around, there wasn't much of an excuse for investigators not contacting them. And we were able to interview enough investigators who didn't work on the case to confirm that if you have someone who says they hear the start of a fire or see the start of a fire, it's always worth talking to them, and there really isn't an excuse not to. So just a little snippet there. And then at the end, we kind of step back in scope and we talk about how different states are approaching wildfire investigations differently. And there are models that Colorado could follow if we wanted to emphasize these investigations more and find the cause of more wildfires, hopefully to prevent future ones. The radio story took a different structure. With radio in general, you kind of have to approach it like you're talking to somebody who's washing their dishes, or you're talking to somebody who is picking their kids up from school. So it's really important to keep it simple. You can't usually fit as many voices into a radio story, and you want to give space. We structured it as a documentary, so you want to really give space for people to tell their own story and just kind of guide the listener between these different voices. When we first went to create this, Ben Marcus, my colleague, he was very much in the story. Like on the very first draft of this, he was narrating the story. And some of the feedback we got was that we actually had to take Ben out of the story and just sort of have him guiding the listener, like I said, between these different voices. So we give Colton a lot of space to describe what he saw at the beginning of the Cameron Peak fire, kind of describe his backpacking trip. And we get to hear from the director of the Division of Fire Prevention and Control and some of these local sheriffs who are struggling with this wildfire problem. And it's more of, it's definitely less data heavy. It's always just really challenging to fit data into a radio story because it does get so complicated and you don't really have the benefit of being able to throw up a bar chart or a map to show people what's going on. For the graphics in the story, I'll just take you through how the mapping evolved. The bar charts are very simple and straightforward, so I won't really spend any time on those, but this was the first draft of the map that I did for Larimer County. It's essentially like a locator map that shows burned area. So we have, in orange, we have natural started wildfires, so High Park, which was started by lightning. In red, there are human started wildfires. And then in gray, because we don't have a confirmed cause yet, we have the Cameron Peak fire. And it's kind of a mess. Like it's too many colors. It's pretty complicated. It's, in my opinion, asking a little bit too much of the reader to sit and spend time and figure out what exactly is happening in this map here. So decided to scale it back. The next version of this map is this one. I just have the Cameron Peak burn area labeled. These are all wildfire outlines that I pulled from the National Interagency Fire Center. I added some transparency so you can see that some wildfires burn the same area more than twice. You get the proximity to Fort Collins, Estes Park is labeled, but this one actually wasn't quite enough detail. So the final version of the map was this one. The title is that wildfires have scorched 1/5 of Larimer County since 2000. That was simple math. You just add up the burn area, subtract the overlap, and look at the area of Larimer County. Added Rocky Mountain National Park, so people who aren't really familiar with the area can see that Cameron Peak burned into part of Rocky Mountain National Park. You can kind of see how the fire hugs that outline. And went ahead and labeled all the other fires. So for people who've lived in Colorado for a while, they might remember the Bobcat fire. They might remember Picnic Rock. And then also that very bottom left one, East Troublesome. That's the other fire that we talk about in the story. You can see that it actually comes into Larimer County. They weren't too far away. Of course, always a scale bar, area of detail. So people who aren't familiar with Larimer County and its specific shape can see that it is on the border with Wyoming. But yeah, so for the final layout, we just kind of put the graphics in where they made the most sense. We had a lot of great photography from our staff photographers. We used one of those as the title image behind the headline. And then after the story came out, it was pretty exciting. Carrie Donovan introduced some legislation to give another $3 million a year to the Division of Fire Prevention and Control to hopefully help fund a team of 17 wildfire investigators. I'm not sure what's going to happen with that legislation before the close of this session, but it was still pretty cool to see that it resonated with one of the state senators enough that she was compelled to introduce some legislation over it. And yes, that is a very quick summary of investigating wildfire investigations. So I would love to answer any questions that anyone has.
So y'all can put questions in the chat. I can read them out, or I mean, just come off of mute too. That's totally fine. I will hold my questions because I think there's probably some other good questions here. I see one from Marcus. Okay, thank you, Marcus. How many people would be involved in creating a story of this scale for radio and web?
Let's see. So for radio, I think we had one main producer. We had our director of audio who helped structure that final radio story. And then we had 2 people who helped mix all of the music. They created original music for this one. I think there were a couple more people involved on the radio side. When we split this one up, Ben kind of headed up that radio side, and then I took the digital side. For the digital side, it was me and Ben that worked on the writing. I did the graphics. We had the photographers for the photography. And then we had one of our website designers help lay out the graphics. And then we had an editor who pulled it all together. So not a huge team. What is that, like 5 people on the digital side, probably closer to 7 or 8 on the radio side.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, and I think maybe what I'll do, thank you for putting some stuff in the chat, y'all. I'll structure these to start with story-specific questions, and we can get broader over time as we start back out to data journalism as a whole. Christy asked a question I was super curious about. How long did this whole process take, and what step in this process took the longest? Was it the data collection? Was it the production? And talk to us a little bit about the timeline of this.
I believe this took 4 months, which was a pretty significant chunk of time. What took the longest was reporting out the data, simply because the data not being there was actually the story, which meant we had to go to every single place the data could possibly be to make sure that it didn't exist somewhere else. Like, to prove that investigations weren't happening, we were basically proving a negative, that they didn't exist. And I had a couple crises in the midst of this where I was like, I just don't know if this data is in good enough shape to be able to publish. So doing all those interviews and talking to all those experts to make sure and do a gut check that this actually was an okay story to tell, that we could use the data for this purpose, that we were on the right track, that piece took the longest.
Yeah, absolutely. Randy's got an interesting question. Does a map visualization like this go through a review process for accuracy? Is there a review process for sort of audience comprehension, I guess, that you guys are going through when you create some big story like this?
Not at Colorado Public Radio. We are a radio station, so the digital side is, well, for graphics, it's me and then a couple editors who have some experience in it. So I run my graphics past them, and we kind of have this like group editing process that we use for graphics. At the New York Times, it was a much bigger team. A project like this might have 30 people involved just for the digital side alone. But with where Colorado Public Radio is at right now, we don't have like we do have a formal review process, but we don't have that like specific level of expertise for mapping.
Cool. Awesome. Interesting question from, hey, Carlos, you asked, so if you were to start from scratch on this story, is there anything you would do differently?
That's a great question. I can't think of anything. I mean, if anything, we over-reported it, but it took that much reporting to figure out where the story actually was. I mean, in retrospect, you're always like, oh, now that I know what the story is, I could have just made these like 20 phone calls and done this data analysis, and we could have had it out the door in like 3 weeks. But hindsight's 2020 like that. So I don't think there was anything else that we had wanted to do that we didn't get to. The benefit of being on the investigations desk is that we do have a lot of time to do stories like this, and we always have the opportunity to work on them until we're completely comfortable with them and can bulletproof them. Oh, there is one thing. in our interviews with the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, they said they had a team of like 5 to 7 to 12 investigators. They kept coming back with that. And it turned out after publication, they came out and said they only had one. So if I could go back in time knowing that, I would have pushed them on it harder. And I also would have submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to actually get their organizational structure. It's a little bit tricky because they were saying that they had like 5 to 12 people approved to investigate wildfires, but they only had one full-time investigator. So just getting more specificity on that would have, that still hurts me when I go back and look at that.
You know, this brought up a question that I had personally. You spend a ton of time on reporting, an enormous amount of time reporting this. Like, how do you know when you're done, quote unquote? Like you've done, I mean, you did a ton of interviews. How do you know that the amount of interviews, the amount of people you've talked to is enough, you know, that you can take a story to print like this?
For like a normal story, like if you're covering a science study, kind of the rule of thumb is if you hear the same thing from 3 people and don't hear something contrary from a bunch of other people, then you're probably okay. For this investigation, it was really just everybody that we could possibly talk to, everybody that would talk to us. And once we started running out of people to talk to, especially within the state of Colorado, and started shaping the story, it was kind of a matter of finding people on the ground to help tell their own stories. Like, you always want to include real people in something like this. But the interesting thing about this one is that we actually we never really heard any conflicting claims like, oh no, Colorado is doing an amazing job investigating their wildfires. Like, from the beginning, we really heard the same thing over and over from people. It was just a matter of figuring out that that's where the story was. So yeah, I guess for this one, it was just running out of people to talk to and then knowing that we had to get the story out the door.
Yeah, totally. So I think that we can start getting a little bit broader sort of to data journalism and what goes on at Colorado Public Radio. Matthew B., you had a good question here. I'm just wondering, you want to come off a mute and ask it yourself? I'm also happy to ask it, but if you're in a spot where you can talk.
Yeah, I was curious about kind of the scope in your background as a data journalist. How generalized or specific do they get? I mean, I'm about to graduate my degree in physics, but this is like a really fun area that I'm looking to go into. So I'm just curious, kind of like how like over a career, how specialized or generalized investigations get in terms of topics and such.
Investigations or data reporting, sorry, which of these?
I guess into investigations and data reporting.
Investigations is interesting because every story is new and different. So on an investigations desk, you're kind of doing any number of things and have to build up your expertise from scratch every time, which is very fun, but can also be challenging. So yeah, it's a broad range. Like on investigations, I've done everything from human health investigations, domestic violence, misconduct in prisons, and then a lot of my climate change reporting experience comes from the climate desk at the New York Times. So yeah, investigations can be super specialized, and yeah, within a newsroom, you're starting over every time. With data journalism, it depends on the organization, but it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. My graduate degree, we worked on, I don't know, we did programming, we worked on stats, we kind of got a broad exposure to everything. And then from there, you can really choose if you want to specialize in something or if you want to kind of generally dabble in everything. So for me, I enjoy math. I like doing statistics. I like making graphics. I like writing. Like, I kind of live in this really happy medium where depending on the story, I can use any one of these skills. For wildfires, we didn't really need to do any statistics work. It was really straightforward analysis. So I got to do graphics and more writing and talking to people. But, you know, if you're looking at different data sets, maybe you do need to lean into that statistics background a little bit more. And then there's also like developing interactive graphics or programming like SQLite databases to interact with a web page so that people can do like a searchable like thing within a story. One of the examples is the New York Times has like how much hotter is your hometown, where you can enter in your city and then see how much hotter it is now than when you were born. So I don't know, there's a ton you can do. And I think it's really just down to like the individual, what you're most interested in and what kind of newsroom you want to work in and what you want to focus on.
Awesome. And Veronica, you started answering a few of the other questions. One that seems similar coming up to this was actually from Lauren. Lauren, I know you. Lauren Gase, you want to share your question, or would you like me to share it?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit broadly to how do you as individuals, or like CPR as a whole, select the topics that you sort of investigate or focus on?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have a system right now with our editor where we'll essentially just pitch him on topics. We'll say, like, this is the data we have. These are the people we've talked to so far. We think like these are the stories that are most helpful. And then the way that he currently structures it is he'll have us do like a sprint for a week or two where we find as much as we can about the story. And we're basically trying to prove that it's a good story to pursue. And then at the end of that, we'll kind of get his feedback and obviously check in with him throughout the process. And he'll either sign off and say, like, this is a great story, or we'll go back to the drawing board and pick one of our other topics and start going from there. We also try to kind of keep this ongoing request log for new data and public record requests, because those take a long time to fill. So as those come back, we can kind of pull those into new reporting documents for new pitches, and then always have like something in our back pocket. So we know that when we finish an investigation, we have something new to start on.
Veronica, I'm also curious personally, how many projects are you working on at the same time? Do you kind of straddle several because these are long investigations, or are you really focused on maybe one or two at once?
Usually I'll primarily focus on one, but I'll kind of nudge other ones along. So right now I'm primarily focusing on getting this one story out the door. But as I've been working on it, I've also been, getting in touch with public records officers to make sure that they're still filling my requests and like sending in those payments and just kind of keeping all of that moving. And, setting up like background interviews with people to learn more about some of those like data requests or some of the records that I've gotten back to kind of see where the story is. So kind of like as I have time and as I have breaks in the story that I'm working on now, I'll just kind of nudge everything else along too.
Awesome. Christy, are you still with us? You want to ask your question about tools? All right, Christy, I'll ask it for you. Christy asks, what tools do you usually use in doing data journalism?
Whatever I need. Usually I'll use Python, like pandas for analysis. And that's usually where I'll make mock graphics as well. Depending on the graphic, I will either later code it into D3 and make it interactive, or I'll export it into Illustrator and get it cleaned up so you can really have a little bit more control over those font sizes. And then for our website, we use AI to HTML to kind of like pull everything from Illustrator onto the website so that you have like PNGs for the graphic, but then the text is actually in HTML. So it's really crisp, which I love. For mapping, I use QGIS, which is the free version of ArcGIS. And as long as it's not like a really heavy spatial analysis, that's totally fine. With ArcGIS, it's like a little bit more accurate if you're doing some heavy lifting with the spatial analyses usually. But yeah, I'll design the maps in there. Again, I usually export those to Illustrator and then use AI to HTML to get this cleaned up. And then like not all reporters have a really strong data background. Not all editors have a really strong data background. I'm sure a lot of you run into this with your colleagues, but I'll also just take chunks of data sets and pull them into like Google Sheets or Excel, just so that I can have like a more simplified version for other people to play with who might not be able to handle something with like a million records. But if you can kind of like create a summary for them so that they can play around with it and explore it, they can always, the hope is that they can find something that maybe you overlooked, or they find something new that you can like continue analyzing and look into. So yeah, I found that Sheets and Excel are great for helping like communicate and share data with colleagues who might not be comfortable doing as much programming. I also use R sometimes for analysis. I haven't used it lately, but haven't needed it. And then, yeah, it just kind of depends. Sometimes like you'll have to use a script to like read images into text. So there are always like libraries that can be explored, but I think half the battle sometimes in data reporting is just doing searches online to figure out what tools are there to help you do your job. So it's kind of like a constant learning process.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. And who else asked about tools? Oh, Chase. Chase, did that also answer your question around like scripting languages for data analysis?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. Erica Nagai, you had a really interesting question here. Do you want to come off of mute and share it, or would you like me to?
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Oh yeah, Matthew, go for it. 100%.
Yeah, just off what you said, sometimes you use R as well. My understanding is Python and R are very similar in the way that they, can handle data and stuff. What situation kind of motivates you to move over to R instead of just kind of sticking with the pandas and matplotlib or whatnot?
Yeah, R is a little bit less fussy when it comes to white space and capitalization. So it's a little more user-friendly, but also it depends on what team I'm working with. If I'm working with a team of reporters who are all working in R and it's more comfortable for me to just switch over and use R to collaborate with them, I will do that. And if I'm working with someone who is more comfortable using pandas, then we'll work in that. So just whatever the project calls for, really. But you're right, they are very similar.
Thanks for that. So Erica asked, not related to wildfire, but just in general, what made you interested in data journalism? And what do you think are kind of the important skills or knowledge to be a great data journalist?
I got interested in data journalism. Well, I was interested in journalism for a while, but it's a rather frightening career change prospect. It's a competitive industry. People always talk about how there's a lot of turnover and it's hard to get a job. So I tried to talk myself out of it for a while, but data journalism seemed like a good fit because it incorporates two things that people don't normally think go together, I think, which is writing and also doing math. And I really like both. And I also really like graphics and graphic design. So when I realized that there was kind of this career path that could combine all of them for me, I got pretty excited about that. And then in terms of what makes a successful data journalist, I think it's a lot of the things that make a successful journalist and also a lot of the things that make just a successful employee, which is, attention to detail. I think it helps to be extremely exact in how just the basics from how you frame a quote that someone gave you to make sure that you're not putting their quote in the wrong context, to double checking all of the data, being really open-minded, running things past people and just asking them, is there something here I'm missing? I tend to be pretty open when I interview people about what I'm working on, so they understand the context of what they're talking to me about. And I always try to ask people at the end of interviews, is there something I'm missing here? Is my framing wrong? Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about? And it's really just kind of checking yourself every step of the way to make sure that you're not missing anything. And curiosity is also pretty helpful. It helps if you're really interested in what you're doing.
Awesome. I think I've kind of gotten through most of the chat questions. If I miss you, I apologize. And why don't you just, anybody else has questions, come off of mute. Would love to hear any other just kind of general questions or questions about this story for Veronica.
I'm about to graduate with my undergraduate, and I'm trying to consider if grad school kind of is a right choice. Is that kind of a necessary thing, to get into the data science? I have some Python experience, I have some investigative experience, none together, but I'm just curious, I guess, in general, on your opinions on that.
I think it kind of varies person to person. Grad school is obviously expensive, so that's a huge consideration. When I was trying to break into journalism, I was doing a lot of freelance writing. And then I was also applying to newsroom jobs, but I kind of fell into this weird catch-22 where I couldn't get a full-time journalism job because I didn't have newsroom experience, but I couldn't get newsroom experience because I'd never been a reporter before. And to get out of that sort of cycle, that's when I decided to go to grad school. But I'd say if you're able to get an internship, especially right out of undergrad, and just get some experience to see if you even like it, that could be a really good way to start. And then you can always like learn on the job as well. The way that I've had other people describe it to me who are in journalism is that grad school is essentially kind of like a 3-year shortcut, where in grad school you learn things that you would like learn by potentially like learn the harder way on the job. So yeah, I don't know. It's a tough question, but there are definitely pros and cons to both, and I think you just got to feel it out and see what's right for you.
I have a question about what stories have inspired you?
Oh, so many.
Data journalism, yeah.
There have been some good recent ones. ProPublica has been doing some pretty cool work. They did a series called Poisoned Places. Oh no, I'm sorry. That was the Center for Public Integrity. ProPublica did one recently on like how to describe this. Essentially toxic emissions from different factories and how that contributes to like raised cancer rates in these certain communities off the United States or around the United States. And there's like a huge overlap there with lower income communities. So that one was really cool because you can really see the impact there. From a visuals perspective, the one that I keep coming back to is Jeremy White did this beautiful mapping project for the New York Times on how the Atlantic Ocean current is weakening. And I think he coded that program like completely from scratch, but it has like it's like this beautiful combination of like taking scientific research and then making this kind of artistic, swirly, really visually pleasing story out of it. So I think anytime that you can take data and really humanize it or make it like artistic or beautiful to look at, that's like a definite win. Another one that comes to mind is it's called canners.nyc, and it was done by an Italian journalist who was reporting in New York City, and it's about these people who collect aluminum cans as a living. So it has like these beautiful little icons that show each person, like instead of a picture. I think that there's like, she wanted to keep it fairly anonymous because there's like a little bit of I don't want to say societal stigma, but people aren't always eager to have their faces attached to the fact that they're like collecting cans for extra income or like as their primary income. But that one did a really beautiful job, like humanizing these people who walk around New York City and collect cans. So projects like that are always great.
I think I saw Marcus come off of mute. Marcus, did you have a question?
Well, yeah, it sounds like a lot of the data is freely available, right? But it also, you mentioned data requests. What do those entail? And I don't even know if this is a smart question, but do you have to like FOIA information sometimes? Does that come into play?
Yes, to all of these things. There's a ton of information that's freely available in the state of Colorado. So you can go to different government websites and just look at the databases there. Sometimes you'll get a report where you're like, I know that you have a database about this that you don't have on your website. And that's where the data requests come in. It's like, you had to do something to get these numbers, and I would like to see what that something is. And sometimes the requests are actually for emails around the data to make sure that you're understanding the data properly and the way that the database was created. There was another part to your question. Am I missing something?
Do you have to FOIA stuff? Is it like, here's the follow-up. Are there people who are difficult to get data from? Like, they probably have it. Or do you have any stories you could share about that? Like, our police organizations come to mind?
Yeah, police organizations is a great example. I've been doing some requests for police agencies, and some of them are, they have a person who's in charge of data requests and FOIA requests and can like speed that process along. And some of them are like, we're going to charge you $15,000 for this request that Denver has for free because we have to have 3 lawyers review it. So then you have to start like fighting the fees and start getting really specific about like the format that you want. Like, we have a lawyer, so sometimes he has to get involved. But it's a little bit agency to agency. Police departments definitely do have a history of being a little bit more cagey. When I was reporting in New York City, a lot of the police departments, it was impossible to get any information out of them, whether it was like records or even just an interview, they would really fight it. And another one that comes to mind actually is health records, but not because people don't want to give them to you, because it's personal information. So you have to be really careful about like death records after an event, if you're trying to figure out how many people died, if there was like an undercount of deaths. Those ones can be difficult, but for reasons that I guess are a little bit more easy to understand at times.
Thank you.
I have a question, Veronica. You mentioned early on about a data memo as you were starting the story. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, how are you keeping track of all of this as the story is unfolding and what tools you're using?
Yeah, I found that I started doing the same analyses multiple times because like different questions would lead me back to the same thing. So one of the examples is like, I looked at which counties were solving more wildfires like 5 different times because I kept just like starting in different places and ending up back there. I was like, oh, I'm curious about this. And then I would do it and be like, oh, I already did this. So for a data memo, I usually just kind of write my findings together as though I'm writing a memo to my editor, which is usually actually exactly what I'm doing. So it's just kind of like in plain terms, what I found, not how I did the analysis, not like the nitty gritty, but like the big takeaway picture and why it's important. And I keep track of that. I also tend to like to do things in Jupyter notebooks because it's easier to kind of incorporate the code with like sentences showing your work. And the plan is actually to start publishing those with our bigger investigations that have like a data component so that it's more transparent so people can look at our work. And it's just one more thing that can kind of give somebody confidence, hopefully, in the work that we've done. But yeah, the data memo, it's really just, you can kind of think about it like if you had to tell somebody a story that day, what would you tell them and where would you start and why is it important? And then you can just keep updating it with analysis as you go.
We have a few more minutes left. Anybody else have questions for Veronica? Veronica, thank you for letting us pepper you, by the way.
I have one question for Veronica.
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks for sharing. And it's a bit of a follow-up of a previous question about the story. I was wondering if anything, something you would like to further explore from the story that maybe was not possible in order to publish, maybe something that, yeah, for whatever reason, it stick there and you would like to further explore the story.
Yeah, ooh. I mean, arson is still really interesting. I think it would still be cool to identify an arsonist, but yeah, like I said, just with the investigative records that we got back on our requests, they just weren't detailed enough. I do suspect that there are some more detailed records out there, which kind of goes back to like the, that question of like getting records from people. Yeah, I feel like there have to be some more detailed records. I don't know where they are yet though, but I think someday I'd like to keep going with that. It's just really interesting. Like Colorado doesn't catch as many arsonists as other states. So there have to be arsonists out there that haven't been identified. And I would like to identify one of them someday.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Gain some CSI vibes from this answer.
Yes.
Love it. Anybody else have anything before we wrap?
I was just curious, how would you go about trying to track down some of that stuff you suspect is out there?
Probably just some more follow-up FOIA requests. Unfortunately, that's like the only tool you really have at your disposal to get those. Yeah, it's just interesting because some of the requests that we received back were really sparse, but if you like some of the requests that we received back from sheriff's departments were really detailed. So it's hard because like I said earlier, each fire has overlapping jurisdiction. And I suspect that one of the other agencies like in charge of that fire might have had more detailed records, but then you have to go through and call every agency and see if they have records and wait to get the requests back. And some of these fires were like decades ago. So there were a few instances where the records no longer existed. They were either lost or like disposed of. But it's basically just like it's like a hunt. You just got to hunt them down.
And one more question that Chrissy posed, which I think is actually a really good one to end on because I want to celebrate, first of all, congratulations on there being an outcome from this, like that there is some policy action that was taken, maybe in part due to some of the information that you made public. Chrissy asked, when you publish a story, do you hope for an outcome or an action? Do you even have like a personal goal? I guess, what do you think about that? Because it's just an enormous amount of work. It's always cool to see something change in the world outside your doors once a project like this is complete.
I guess the main hope is always just that somebody like reads it and cares. As reporters, I don't know, some news outlets are a little bit different and they advocate for certain outcomes, but at Colorado Public Radio and most other news organizations, you really try to not get too involved in that way. You're not really like slanting the story because you want a specific outcome. You're really just trying to inform people of what's going on, and then they can kind of take it from there. Like they have the information, they're able to make their own decisions. So you're trying to present the different angles to it as fairly as you can. But that being said, it is always really cool to see that, you know, like in our reporting, we identified what we thought was a problem, and like other people agreed that it was a problem and then tried to put some money there to fix it. Like that's always really great to see. But yeah, in terms of impact, like it's something that the journalism industry has really struggled with. I think that in journalism in general, newsrooms started falling into this trap where they measured impact by page views, because that was also how advertising revenue was tied to the agency or the newsroom. And that's not always the best measure of it, but in terms of like actual metrics, I'm not sure if as an industry, we've come up with anything more impactful, because you can have a story with like a clickbaity headline that gets 2 million views, and then you can get a story that doesn't get very many reads, but you know, maybe some policy changes because of it. And to try and compare those two impacts it can be challenging. And I don't know if we really have a good way of doing it yet, but yeah, the goal is always just to reach as many people as we can and see if we can convince them to read our article and learn something about something they didn't know about.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you've succeeded at that, and you've succeeded at some policy change here. So that's awesome. I think now's a good time to wrap this conversation. So can everybody just give like a round of applause or some snaps via your video if you're on video for Veronica? Really appreciate your time, you know, sharing everything you've done here. Fascinating to get behind the scenes for data journalism. So I put a few comments in the chat. Essentially, Denver Data Storytellers is a website. Thank you, Katie. Katie helped us redesign our website. So you can check us out there. We have an email newsletter that goes out every month. Krista, who is on this, helps send that out. And then we've got a Slack channel as well. So those are all ways that you can continue to engage with us. We've got a book club coming up later this summer. We will have a few other things going on probably towards the fall as well. So have some patience with us, but we'll try and continue to do more social stuff, some educational stuff, and always, you know, just very grateful for the other volunteers that help organize and folks like Veronica who volunteer their time to share their expertise. So, with that, thanks everybody. I will send out an email with some follow-up resources. Veronica, I'll grab some of those recommended stories you talked about as well. So I'll send that to everybody, and we'll stay in touch. So thanks again for your time. Thanks again, Veronica. Y'all have a great afternoon, okay? Bye, everyone.